The autumn wind turned the pages of the worn notebook Fiona held in her hands. 62 years of life had taught her that the most important details were best written down. She was sitting in an old Volvo in front of the luxurious Oakwood estate and couldn't take her eyes off the wrought iron gate that opened onto a well-kept alley of ancient oaks. "A mechanic, then," she whispered, gripping the steering wheel with her white fingers. Just a mechanic who didn't even have the money for normal alimony. 3 years ago, during his divorce, Sebastian swore he was barely making ends meet. Now he lived in a mansion worth at least $2 million. Fiona pulled an old photo out of her purse, showing her and Sebastian smiling in front of their former modest house. 25 years of marriage, and now it was all a lie. "Mrs., are you all right?" a man's voice suddenly said. Fiona flinched. The estate security guard was standing by her car. "Yes, I'm fine," she answered, trying to make her voice sound confident. I'm looking for a job. I heard they need a gardener." The guard gave her an appraising look. "Are you sure? It's not an easy job for whom?" Fiona interrupted him. "For a woman my age?" She straightened her back. "I have 20 years of experience with plants. My own garden was always the best in the neighborhood." It was true. Fiona really did love gardening, although in recent years she had been selling clothes for the elderly online. The small online store allowed her to stay afloat after her divorce left her with a miserable pittance of jointly owned property. The guard shrugged his shoulders. "Okay, wait here. I'll call the manager." As he walked away, Fiona stared at the stately home. The windows on the second floor were open and a light breeze played with the lace curtains. Suddenly, a young woman appeared on the balcony. A slender blonde in a silk robe. This was probably the same Belinda that Fiona had learned about from her old friend Margaret. 28 years old, Fiona thought. Almost as old as She broke off, pushing away the painful memories of the daughter she had lost in childbirth many years ago. "The manager will see you now," the guard returned. "Please drive to the service entrance." Fiona started the car. The plan was beginning to take effect. She spent 3 months getting ready. She changed her hairstyle, started wearing simple clothes, even changed the way she spoke a little. Now, instead of an elegant businesswoman, the mirror reflected a simple woman looking for a job in her late years. The service entrance was on the other side of the mansion. Fiona parked and, taking her folder of documents, headed for the door. In the hall, she was met by a tall man in his 50s with graying temples. "Mrs. Thompson," he said to her. "I'm Richard Harris, the estate manager." "Yes, that's me," Fiona replied, mentally thanking herself for her foresight. All her new documents were in that name. "Let's go to my office," Richard said. "Tell us why you are interested in this position." Fiona followed him down a long corridor, carefully examining the interior. Expensive paintings, crystal chandeliers, antique furniture, everything screamed of wealth. Wealth that her ex-husband had hidden during the divorce. In the manager's office, Fiona sat down in a chair across from a massive desk. She noticed a photo of the house on the wall, apparently taken right after the renovation. "I've worked with plants all my life," she began her prepared story. "In recent years, I took care of the garden at a private estate in Italy, but I had to return because of my sister's health problems." Richard looked through her documents carefully. "You have a truly impressive background, Mrs. Thompson, but the work here will not be easy. The owner is very demanding about the garden." The master, Fiona thought. Sebastian has always dreamed of being called that. "I'm ready for any demands," she replied. "I need this job." At that moment, the office door opened. Fiona felt her heart sink as Sebastian stood on the doorstep. He hadn't changed much over the past 3 years. The same dark hair with gray at the temples, straight nose, strong chin. Only his suit was now from a famous designer, not a mechanic's overalls. "Richard, have you seen—" Sebastian stumbled, noticing the visitor. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had an interview." Fiona sat still, grateful that the sun from the window was shining down on her back, leaving her face in shadow. Sebastian gave her an indifferent look and turned to the manager again. "We'll talk later." When the door closed behind him, Fiona exhaled. He didn't recognize her. The plan was working. "Well, Mrs. Thompson," Richard said, "I think we can give it a try. A week's trial and then we'll see." "Thank you," Fiona said. "When can I start?" "Tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock. Laura, our housekeeper, will show you around the farm." As Fiona walked back to the car, she could feel her hands shaking. She had taken the first step. Now the main thing was to hold on and find out the truth. The truth about how a mechanic from a small town suddenly became the owner of a luxurious estate. And most importantly, what happened to their joint savings, which mysteriously disappeared shortly before the divorce. Getting into the car, Fiona pulled out her phone and typed a message to her friend Margaret. "I'm settled. He didn't recognize me. Let's get started." On the way home, she thought about her last conversation with Margaret. "Are you sure you want to do this?" her friend asked. "Maybe it's better to go to a lawyer?" "Lawyers?" Fiona smiled bitterly then. 3 years ago, they were of no help. If I want to find out the truth, I'll have to do it myself. Stopping outside her modest rented house, Fiona looked at her notebook again. Tomorrow, a new life begins. A life as a gardener, Mrs. Thompson, who just wants to take care of plants. And no one, especially Sebastian, must guess that she is actually looking for evidence of his lies. Fiona went to the mirror and looked at her reflection for a long time. Her new hairstyle, simple clothes, and lack of makeup made her look like an ordinary elderly woman. But the same fire still burned in her eyes as it had 25 years ago when she first met Sebastian. Only now it was not a fire of love, but of determination to find out the truth. The first week of work at the estate was not easy for Fiona. Every morning at 7:30 she was already there, dressed in a simple work suit and worn boots. Her hands, once well-groomed and manicured, were now covered with calluses from gardening tools. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Richard greeted her one morning as she was pruning the roses at the main entrance. "How are the new seedlings coming along?" "Very well, Mr. Harris," Fiona replied, straightening up. "Although the soil here is quite heavy, it needs more fertilizer." Richard nodded, but his gaze remained attentive and a little suspicious. Fiona had already noticed that the manager was constantly watching her, as if waiting for her to make a mistake. At that moment, a black Mercedes drove up to the building. Sebastian was driving, and Belinda was next to him in a short dress and high heels. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson, Miss Gray," Richard greeted politely. Sebastian just nodded in response, not even glancing in the gardener's direction. Belinda, on the other hand, gave Fiona a haughty look. "Richard, make sure the gardener doesn't touch my favorite white roses. She cut them too short last time." "Of course, Miss Gray," the manager replied, and when the couple left, he added quietly, "Mrs. Thompson, be careful with Miss Gray's roses. She is very demanding." Fiona nodded, swallowing the insult. She used to pick her own roses, order them from the best nursery in England, and now some girl was telling her how to care for them. "Mr. Harris," she said to the manager, "I notice that the soil is sinking in the far corner of the garden. Perhaps there is a problem with drainage." Richard raised his eyebrows. "Really? And what do you propose? If you allow me, I could draw up a work plan. I have experience in solving such problems." The manager looked at her thoughtfully. "Okay, prepare your proposals. Meet me tomorrow at 9 in my office." Fiona worked on the plan all evening. She knew that this was her chance to show her competence and perhaps earn Richard's trust. The next day, she presented a detailed project with drawings and calculations. Richard studied the documents carefully. "Impressive, Mrs. Thompson. Where did you learn to draw up project documentation so professionally?" Fiona was ready for this question. My late husband was a builder. I learned a lot from him. This was the first lie that was difficult for her, but she reminded herself that the end justifies the means. Well, Richard said, I think we can try to implement your plan. But first, I need to tell you something. He paused. I've made inquiries about your past employment in Italy. Fiona felt her heart sink. Did something go wrong with the forged documents? And what did you find out? She asked calmly. The references were confirmed. But you know, Mrs. Thompson, in this estate we value confidentiality very much. The owners don't like undue attention to their private lives. I understand, Fiona replied. I assure you, I know how to keep my mouth shut, I hope so, because there have been incidents. Last year I had to fire a maid who was too interested in the owner's affairs. That's it, Fiona thought. That's why he's so suspicious. Mr. Harris, she said firmly, I'm only here for the job. It's hard to find a good job at my age, and I appreciate this opportunity. Richard nodded. Okay, you can start the drainage work, but first show the estimate to Miss Gray. She handles all financial matters. Belinda is in charge of finance? Fiona was surprised. I wonder... Later that day, she met Belinda in the garden. The young woman was on the phone. Yes, everything is under control. No, he doesn't even know. Okay, I'll meet you there. Seeing Fiona, Belinda abruptly ended the conversation. Do you need anything? Mr. Harris asked me to show you the estimate for the drainage system. Belinda looked through the papers. Okay, I'll check it out and let you know what I think. Your decision, Fiona thought. What about Sebastian? It's his money. In the evening, while putting away the tools, Fiona overheard two maids talking. Did you hear? Miss Gray went to town again for a secret meeting. Hush. Have you forgotten what happened to Martha? Mind your own business. Martha, Fiona wrote down in her mind. I'll have to find out more about her. On the way home, she reflected on everything she had learned that day. Belinda is clearly hiding something. Richard doesn't trust new people because of some past incident. And Sebastian, he seems to have completely entrusted the management of his affairs to his young mistress. At home, Fiona took out her secret diary and wrote down all her observations. Then she sat for a long time looking at the photo where she and Sebastian were still happy. How could he have changed so much? And most importantly, where did all this money come from? The phone rang. It was Margaret. How are you? Have they found you out? So far, everything is going according to plan, Fiona replied. But there is something interesting. Can you find out who Marta is? She used to work here as a maid and was fired last year. I'll try. Be careful, Fee. You're playing with fire. I know, but I have to find out the truth. As Fiona went to bed, she thought about the fact that tomorrow she would have to play the role of a simple gardener again. She would have to endure Belinda's arrogant glances, pretend not to notice Sebastian's indifference, and earn the trust of the suspicious Richard. But she will endure, for the sake of truth, for the sake of justice, and for the sake of herself. Congratulations, Mrs. Thompson. You've been hired full-time. Richard's words echoed in Fiona's head as she woke up the next morning. Her first official day at work. Now, she had every right to be at the estate, and this opened up new opportunities for investigation. Putting on her work suit, she looked in the mirror. These days she had learned to move differently, to speak more quietly, to look more modestly. No one would recognize this simple gardener as the ex-wife of the manor's owner. "Good morning, Laura," she greeted the housekeeper as she entered through the service entrance. "Oh, Mrs. Thompson." Laura, a plump woman of about 50, smiled warmly. "I heard you were accepted. Congratulations. Would you like a cup of coffee?" Fiona hesitated. On the one hand, she didn't want to get too close to the staff. On the other hand, you can learn a lot of interesting things from the maids. "Thank you. I'd love that." It was quiet in the staff kitchen as the owners were still asleep. Laura put a cup of coffee in front of Fiona. "How do you like working here? Are you getting used to it?" Fiona: "Little by little. Although the estate is large, there is so much work." "Yes, the owner likes everything to be perfect," Laura nodded. "Although he hasn't been as interested in that lately. It's all Miss Gray and Miss Gray." At that moment, a young maid came into the kitchen. "Laura, Miss Gray has left again. She hasn't even had breakfast." "Quiet, Catherine," the housekeeper shouted. "It's none of our business." But Fiona was already on the alert. "Does she often leave so early?" "Almost every day lately," Catherine whispered. "And she comes back late. And Mr. Wilson doesn't seem to notice." "Catherine," Laura said sternly, "get back to work. And you, Mrs. Thompson, I suppose, have some work to do in the garden too?" Fiona took the hint. After finishing her coffee, she went about her duties. But the conversation never left her mind. What was Belinda doing in the city? And why was Sebastian so indifferent to her constant absences? It was a hot day. Fiona was working near the hedge when she heard the rumble of a motorcycle. Sebastian was leaving for work. "I wonder," she thought, "if his employees at the car repair shop know that their boss lives in a luxury mansion." Suddenly, movement near the garage caught her attention. Richard was handing something to the driver, a package. He quickly put it in the trunk and drove off. Fiona pretended to be completely engrossed in trimming the bushes, but she watched the manager out of the corner of her eye. He stood looking after the car, then pulled out his phone. "Yes, everything has been sent. No, no one saw it. Okay, I'll tell Miss Gray when she gets back." Something is wrong here, Fiona thought as she continued to work. There are too many secrets for an ordinary estate. The afternoon brought new observations. Belinda returned, but not alone. She was accompanied by a tall man in an expensive suit. They quickly walked into the house without even looking at the gardener who was tending to the flowers. "Who's that?" Fiona asked Tom, the gardener who was working nearby quietly. "He comes here often," Tom shrugged. "Some businessman. He and Miss Gray always lock themselves in the library." "The library?" Fiona was surprised. "But that's where Sebastian kept all his important documents." An hour later the man left, and Belinda went out into the garden. She looked worried and kept checking her phone. When the device rang, she quickly moved away. "Yes, he signed. No, he didn't even read it. Of course, I control everything. Don't worry, darling. Everything is going according to plan." "Honey?" Fiona froze. "So Belinda has a lover? And a plan?" The evening brought another discovery. While putting away the tools in the shed, Fiona accidentally hit an old shelf. An envelope fell to the floor. Inside were photos of Belinda with the same man in a suit. They were hugging, kissing. The date on the back was 2 months ago. On the way home, Fiona could hardly contain her excitement. She took out her notebook and wrote down everything she had noticed that day. Belinda's frequent trips to the city. The mysterious packages Richard sends her, Sebastian's conversation about legitimate documents, Belinda's meetings with an unknown man, the photos that proved their connection. What does this all mean? She thought. Is Belinda just using Sebastian? And what does this have to do with his sudden wealth? The phone rang. Margaret. "Fee, I found out something about Martha. She's—" "Wait," Fiona interrupted. "Not on the phone. Let's meet tomorrow. And one more thing. Can you check on someone? He's tall, about 40, always wears expensive suits. He comes to the estate a lot." "Okay, I'll try. But be careful, Fee. If they get suspicious, don't worry. All they see is an old gardener who likes to dig in the ground." At night, Fiona could not sleep for a long time. She kept seeing the painting, Sebastian signing some papers without even reading them, Belinda secretly meeting with her lover, Richard sending mysterious packages. What connects all these people? And most importantly, where is her stolen money hidden in this story? Nothing. she thought, finally falling asleep. Now I have access to the estate. Sooner or later I will find all the answers, and then Sebastian will regret trying to deceive me. Meanwhile, the light in Richard's office was on. The manager was sitting over his papers, occasionally raising his head and looking out the window as if he was waiting for someone. On his desk was a folder labeled Personnel, and in it was the personal file of the new gardener, Mrs. Thompson. The August sun was blazing mercilessly as Fiona worked by the alpine hill. Sweat dripped down her back, but she kept going. These rare alpine plants needed special care. Suddenly a shadow fell on her. "Good job," a familiar voice said. Fiona froze. Sebastian was standing behind her. She slowly straightened up, trying to calm the trembling in her hands. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson." He looked at her with a strange expression. "You know, you have very skillful hands. It's rare to find a gardener who knows alpine plants so well." "Of course," Fiona thought. "You bought me the first seedlings for our old garden." "I have a lot of experience, sir," she replied, looking down. "And where did you work before?" "In Italy, on a private estate." Sebastian nodded. "And why did you come back?" "Family reasons," she answered briefly. He looked at her again with that strange look. "You know, you remind me of someone." Fiona's heart skipped a beat. "Did he really recognize me? Really?" she asked calmly. "Yes, but I can't remember who," he shrugged. "Good work, Mrs. Thompson," she suggested. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson." He left, and Fiona could not calm down for a long time. How easy it would be to tell him everything now to expose his lies. But no, she had to find out the truth some other way. All day long she felt his eyes on her. He passed her more often than usual as if he was trying to remember something, and in the evening, Fiona stayed in the garden to finish watering. It was getting dark and the lights were coming on in the windows of the mansion. Suddenly she heard voices from the second-floor terrace. "Sebastian, you seem strange today." It was Belinda. "I'm just tired, dear. You need to relax." Fiona froze in the shade of the trees. On the terrace, Belinda was hugging Sebastian, her arms sliding down his chest. He pulled her close, kissing her greedily. 25 years ago, he had kissed her, Fiona, in the same way. Then they were young, in love, full of dreams of the future. "Oh yes, darling," Belinda whispered. "You're so tense." Fiona turned away, feeling nausea approaching her throat, but she forced herself to stay. Maybe she would hear something important. "Belinda," Sebastian's voice was hoarse, "are you sure everything is in order with the papers?" "Of course, darling. I have everything under control. It's just that there have been so many inspections lately." "Shh," she pressed a finger to his lips. "Don't think about it. Think about me." Their shadows merged into one. Fiona heard fragments of whispers, sighs. She remembered other nights when Sebastian had embraced her as passionately, when they had made love under the stars, when they had dreamed of eternity. "I'm a fool," she thought now. "How could I have been so blind? Didn't I see the signs?" Suddenly the conversation upstairs changed tone. "By the way," Belinda said, "Robert is coming tomorrow. We need to sign new papers. Again?" Sebastian's voice sounded irritated. "How many papers can you sign? Honey, it's necessary. You trust me, don't you?" "Of course, but then don't ask. Just sign like you always do." "Robert?" Fiona wrote down in her mind. "I'll have to tell Margaret and have her check that name." She walked quietly away from the terrace, but her heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed to be heard throughout the garden. Thoughts swarmed in her head. Who is Robert? Why does Sebastian sign papers without reading them? And most importantly, what is Belinda hiding? At home, Fiona took out an album with old photos. Here she and Sebastian are at their wedding, young and happy. Here is their first vacation. He is carrying her on the beach. Here is the birthday of their... No, it is better not to remember that day. She turned the page and saw a photo taken a month before the divorce. They were still living together, but there was already a gap between them. Now Fiona could see it in their eyes, in their tense smiles. When did it all go wrong, she thought. When did he start lying? And most importantly, why? The phone rang. Margaret. "Fee, you won't believe it. I found Martha. She works in a small hotel outside the city. She says she's ready to meet you." "Oh, great. Oh, and can you find out about a Robert? He's coming to the estate tomorrow." "Yes, sir, but, Fee, be careful. I can see how much this is affecting you. Don't worry. The old feelings are long gone." But as she went to bed, Fiona knew that wasn't true. The scene on the terrace had awakened something deep inside her. Not love, no. Rather pain and rage. Rage at the man who had traded 25 years of marriage for a young body, who had deceived her, taken away everything they had gained together. "It's okay," she thought as she fell asleep. "Tomorrow this Robert will come, and perhaps this will be the key to unraveling the whole mystery." In the mansion, the light was still on in the master bedroom. Belinda was sitting at the dressing table combing her hair. The mirror reflected the figure of Sebastian, who was standing by the window. "You know," he said suddenly, "this new gardener. She looks so much like—" "Like who?" Belinda interrupted him abruptly. "It doesn't matter," he shook his head. "I must have imagined it." Belinda looked at his reflection in the mirror for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a message. "We need to talk. Urgent." Margaret did not disappoint. Information about Robert appeared the very next day. Robert Kingsley, 43 years old, a financial consultant. He was also an old acquaintance of Belinda's, as it turned out from the 3-year-old photos that Margaret found on social media. "Be careful," her friend warned. "He has a dubious reputation. They say he's involved in several financial scandals." Fiona nodded. She had already prepared a small recorder that she could hide in the pocket of her work apron. The day began as usual. Fiona was tending to the garden when a black Jaguar pulled up to the estate. Robert got out, a tall man in an impeccable suit. Belinda met him at the door. "Darling, we've been waiting for you." Fiona strained her ears. "Darling?" The same word she had heard on the phone. "Are the documents ready?" Robert asked, heading into the house. "Yes, Sebastian will sign everything." Fiona slowly moved closer to the open window of the study. Under the pretext of pruning roses, she could hear almost everything. "Listen, Sebastian," Robert's voice came through. "This is just a formality, just a power of attorney to manage some assets." "But why now?" was Sebastian's voice. "We formalized everything last month." "Honey," Belinda interjected, "it's for your own good. You know I care about our future." "Our future," Sebastian muttered. "What about the 5 million? What happened to it?" Fiona almost dropped the pruning shears. 5 million? Where does a simple mechanic get that kind of money? "Everything is under control," Robert assured her. "The money is in a safe place. By the way, do you remember John Harrison?" Fiona shuddered. John Harrison was an old acquaintance of hers who worked at the bank where she and Sebastian kept their savings. He was the one who had handled their accounts before the divorce. "Harrison?" Sebastian asked again. "The banker? What does he have to do with this? He's going to help us with legalizing some things." At that moment, someone touched her shoulder. Fiona barely contained her scream as Richard stood behind her. "Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly, "don't you think these roses have been cut enough?" "Yes, of course," she mumbled. "I just wanted to make sure. Come with me. We need to talk." In his office, Richard was silent for a long time, looking through some papers. "You know, Mrs. Thompson," he finally said, "I often review personnel files of employees, especially the new ones. And you know what's interesting? Your file raises questions." "What kind of questions?" Fiona asked calmly. "For example, Why did an experienced gardener from Italy suddenly accept such a modest position? And why does Mr. Wilson say you remind him of someone? Mr. Harris, Fiona looked him straight in the eye. I just want to work in peace. It's hard to find a good job at my age. At that moment, Belinda entered the office. Richard, I want to talk to you about the new gardener. She stumbled when she saw Fiona. Oh, you're here. Well, you can go. Fiona left, but thanks to the recorder, she continued to hear the conversation. Who is she, Richard? Belinda's voice was sharp. Sebastian says she reminds him of someone. Could that be a problem? I've checked all the paperwork. They're all in order, but what? Something's not right. I can feel it. Find out what, and find it fast. We don't have time for problems. Later, at home, Fiona listened to the recording of the conversation in the office. 5 million. John Harrison. Legalization. What did it all mean? She pulled out her old diary. 3 years ago, before the divorce, there were only a few thousand in their joint account. But she and Sebastian had been saving all their lives. Where had their savings gone? The phone rang. Margaret. Fee. I found something about Robert Kingsley. He worked for some investment company, but 3 years ago he was fired because of suspected fraud. 3 years ago. That's when she and Sebastian broke up. And, Margaret continued, I found Marta. She's ready to meet you tomorrow. Good. Perhaps she knows something important. Fiona sat over her notes for a long time. Something was beginning to emerge. But what? How are Robert, Belinda, and the missing money connected? And what role does John Harrison play in all this? Meanwhile, another conversation continued in the mansion. Are you sure you have everything under control? Robert asked Belinda. Don't worry, my dear. Everything will be over soon. Sebastian will sign the last papers, and the gardener? Richard will take care of her. If she's a threat, we know what to do. A small cafe on the outskirts of town seemed like the perfect place to meet. Fiona sat at a table by the window, nervously stirring her coffee. When the bell above the door announced a new visitor, she immediately recognized Martha, a short woman in her 30s with a wary look. Mrs. Thompson? Martha asked quietly, sitting down across from her. Yes, Fiona replied. Thank you for seeing me. Martha looked around nervously. We don't have much time. If they find out, who? Belinda and that man, Robert, I overheard them talking a year ago. That's what got me fired. Fiona stepped forward. Tell me everything you know. The story that Martha told her was astonishing. 3 years ago, Belinda was working for Robert Kingsley's company, a small investment firm that later turned out to be involved in money laundering. They were looking for, how shall I put it, a scapegoat, Martha explained. Someone on whom they could draw up documents. And then Mr. Wilson appeared. How did they meet? At the car repair shop. Belinda had arranged a meeting there on purpose. She knew he had a weakness for young women. Fiona remembered how Sebastian had been working late at work recently before the divorce. So, this is it. At first it was just a fling, Martha continued. But then Robert realized it was the perfect match. A simple mechanic, whom no one would think of. And what did they do? Belinda turned his head. He left his wife and started living with her. Meanwhile, she and Robert, Martha trailed off, looking around. What did they do? Fiona insisted. They used his signature on documents, opening accounts, making transactions. Mr. Wilson didn't even read what he was signing. He trusted Belinda so much. And John Harrison? What was his role? Martha's eyes widened. How do you know about Harrison? It doesn't matter. Just tell me. He helped them with their banking operations. He transferred money through different accounts to cover his tracks. Fiona felt everything fall into place. Now she understood where her and Sebastian's savings had gone. Harrison had helped them move it to other accounts just before the divorce. And the estate? She asked. Where did that money come from? It's all laundered money. They bought it with a shell company and then re-registered it to Mr. Wilson. He thinks it's a gift from Belinda, that she inherited a fortune from a rich uncle. My God, Fiona thought, what a gullible fool you are, Sebastian. Why did you decide to tell me all this? Martha looked down. When they fired me, they threatened me. I was afraid. But now, they have new plans. I heard them discussing something big, something that could lead to serious problems. What kind of trouble? I don't know the details, but they want Mr. Wilson to sign some important papers. And then, she didn't finish. Her phone rang. I have to go, Martha said, getting up. Be careful, Mrs. Thompson. They are dangerous people. On the way back to the estate, Fiona could hardly contain her emotions. Everything had come together like a puzzle, every piece in its place. Belinda and Robert used her ex-husband for their machinations, and he, blinded by the young beauty, did not even notice that he had become a pawn in someone else's game. In the garden, everything was as usual. Fiona was mechanically doing her job, but her mind was racing. What to do with this information? Should she tell Sebastian? But would he believe her? Near the alpine slide, she saw Belinda and Robert. They were talking intensely about something. Is everything ready? Belinda's voice came to her. Yes. Tomorrow he'll sign the final documents. And then we'll get rid of him? Belinda's voice sounded coldly cruel. Quiet, Robert hissed. This is no place for such talk. Fiona felt her blood run cold. Will they get rid of her? What were they up to? She spent a long time at home that evening going through her notes. Now everything was clear. Belinda's constant absences, secret meetings, and Sebastian's strange behavior. He had fallen victim to professional fraudsters who used his gullibility and weakness for young women. The phone rang. Margaret. Fee, I checked out those companies you asked for. They're all connected to Robert Kingsley. And you know what? 3 of them went bankrupt under strange circumstances. And the owners? They disappeared. Just disappeared, Fee. No one knows what happened to them. Fiona felt a chill run down her spine. Was this the same fate that awaited Sebastian? What are you going to do? Margaret asked. I don't know, Fiona answered honestly. But I can't let them destroy him. But it's his own fault. He left you for her. Yes, Fiona said quietly. But I'm not like him, no matter how much it hurts, and I won't let these bastards use him. She walked to the window. The lights of the mansion flickered in the darkness. Somewhere out there, her ex-husband might be hugging the woman who was planning to destroy him. What have you done, Sebastian? Fiona thought. How can I save you now? Meanwhile, at the mansion, Belinda was sitting in the study with Richard. Are you sure about the gardener? She asked. Something is wrong with her, the manager replied. But I can't figure out what it is. Find out, quickly. We have very little time left. What they didn't know was that at that moment Fiona was already working on a plan to save the man who had once broken her heart but was still a part of her life. Fiona knew this day would come. She could see Richard watching her, scrutinizing her every move. And today, Mrs. Thompson, come to my office. His tone did not bode well. She entered the room where she had been so many times before as a gardener. Richard was sitting at his desk, her personal file in front of him. Sit down, he said dryly. We need to talk seriously. Fiona sat down, feeling her pulse quicken, but she remained calm on the outside. I've been watching you for a long time, Richard began. And you know what's interesting? You know this garden too well. Too well for someone who has just arrived. Yes, Richard, I do. The office fell silent. Richard stared at her, wide-eyed. You're Mrs. Wilson? The former Mrs. Wilson. She straightened up in her chair. And I know all about Belinda and Robert's machinations. Richard stood up abruptly. I have to tell you. Sit down, Fiona said calmly, and listen to me carefully. You don't want to spend the next 10 years in prison, do you? He froze. What do you mean? The packages you send, The documents that pass through your hands. Do you think I don't understand what this is? Money laundering, fraud, forgery. I'm just following orders, he muttered, sinking into his chair. And that's your excuse? Fiona pulled out a tape recorder from her purse. I have recordings of your conversations with Belinda. I have proof of all the transactions. Enough for you to keep her and Robert company in prison. Richard wiped the sweat from his brow. What do you want? The truth. And your help. My help? Yes. You'll testify before the police. You will tell them everything you know about their machinations. They will kill me, he whispered. And the police will protect you. If you cooperate, you will get a reduced sentence. Richard was silent for a long time, drumming his fingers on the table. What if I refuse? Fiona stood up. Then I'm going to the police right now, with all the evidence. And you will get the full term as an accomplice. You're bluffing. Do you want to check? Their eyes met. Fear flashed in Richard's eyes. Okay, he finally said. What do you want me to do? Nothing for now. You can continue as usual, but tell Belinda I'm clean, that you've checked everything. And you? And I'm going to go gather the last of the evidence. Tomorrow they're planning something big. I have to find out what. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. It was Belinda. Richard, did you find out anything about the gardener? Fiona managed to grab a pair of pruning shears and pretended to report back to the garden. Richard cleared his throat. Yes, Miss Gray. I have checked everything. Mrs. Thompson, she's just in a difficult situation. Debt. Problems with the bank. She's afraid she's going to lose her job, so she's been acting strange. Belinda gave Fiona a suspicious look. Are you sure? Fiona. Absolutely. I personally checked all the documents. Good. Belinda nodded. Then get busy preparing for tomorrow's meeting. Everything must be perfect. When she left, Richard sank heavily into his chair. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, so tell me. For the next 2 hours, Richard talked. He told me about how Belinda appeared in their city 3 years ago, how she met Sebastian, how she manipulated him, gradually separating him from his family. And then Robert appeared, Richard said. And these operations began. At first, small ones, some transfers, documents, then more and more. And Sebastian? He didn't notice anything. She completely took over his mind. He signed everything she asked. And tomorrow? Richard was nervous. Tomorrow is the final act. They have prepared documents to transfer all the property to offshore companies. And then what? I don't know exactly. But I heard them talking, something about an accident. Fiona felt her blood run cold. Are they going to kill him? I think so. What do you expect? He knows too much. Fiona stood up. I need copies of all the documents, everything you have. It's risky, more risky than going to jail for a long time. When Fiona returned home that evening, she had a flash drive with the evidence in her bag. She called Margaret. Everything is ready. Call your friend from the police. Tomorrow they will try to pull their latest scam. And Sebastian? Fiona stopped, looking at the windows of the mansion. I have to save him, no matter what. At this time, Belinda was talking to Robert at the mansion. Is everything ready for tomorrow? Robert. Yes. After signing the documents, we'll take him to the lake. A fishing accident. Who would suspect? And the gardener. Richard says she's clean. Just a scared woman with debts. They didn't know that at that moment the frightened woman was preparing a trap that would put an end to their plans, and to save the man she once loved. The morning was gloomy. Heavy clouds hung over the estate as if anticipating the dramatic events of the day. Fiona arrived earlier than usual. She had to get everything ready. Good morning, Mrs. Thompson, Richard greeted her. His eyes were full of anxiety. They're leaving in an hour. Are the police ready? Yes, they are. They'll be following the car from a safe distance. Fiona nodded. The plan was simple. Robert and Belinda were to drive Sebastian to the lake after signing the documents. There, they planned, an accident would occur. But the police would be on the lookout. They heard movement in the house. Fiona started working in the garden but kept an eye on the front door. Belinda came out in an elegant suit, followed by Robert with a briefcase of documents. Sebastian was the last to arrive. "It's a beautiful day for fishing, isn't it?" Belinda said cheerfully. "After all that paperwork, you need to rest, dear." Fiona squeezed the handle of the shovel. "Darling." How easy that word came out of the mouth of a woman who was planning a murder. "I don't know if I should," Sebastian began. "Come on," Robert interrupted. "We'll sign the documents quickly, and then we'll have a great time in nature." They got into the car, a black Mercedes. Fiona waited until they were out of the gate, then quickly headed for her Volvo. "Is everything ready?" she asked Margaret on the phone. "Yes, the police are already in position. Are you sure you want to be there in person? I have to." The drive to the lake took 40 minutes. Fiona kept a safe distance, knowing that inconspicuous police cars were driving ahead and behind her. Her mind was full of memories. How she and Sebastian had come to this lake before, how they had dreamed of building a house here, how they had planned to bring their children here. Finally, the Mercedes turned onto a dirt road that led to a deserted shore. Fiona parked a little further and came closer, hiding behind the trees. "Here we go," she heard Robert's voice. "Just one last signature and we're done." "What exactly am I signing?" Sebastian asked. "Just a formality, dear," Belinda purred. "A power of attorney to manage certain assets. But why here?" "Because we're going to have a great time afterwards." Belinda took a picnic basket out of the trunk. "I even brought some champagne." Fiona saw Sebastian leaning over the documents. At that moment, Robert quietly took something out of his pocket. It was a syringe. "Stop! Police!" a loud voice suddenly shouted. Everything happened in a flash. Armed policemen jumped out of the bushes. Robert tried to throw the syringe, but they immediately twisted him. Belinda screamed and ran away, but she was quickly detained. "What's going on?" Sebastian stood stunned, looking at the scene. "Something that should have happened a long time ago," Fiona said, coming out from behind the trees. She took off her gardener's hat and let her hair down. Sebastian took a step back. "Fiona, is that you?" "Yes, it's me, your new gardener. But I don't understand." "You'll understand now," she turned to the police. "I have all the evidence of their fraud. Recordings of conversations, documents, testimonies of accomplices." Belinda looked at her furiously. You old hag, how dare you?" "Shut up!" the policeman shouted, snapping the handcuffs on her. "A syringe with poison was found in the car," another officer reported. Sebastian shook his head. "Poison? You wanted to kill me?" "Honey, it's not what you think," Belinda cried out. "Don't call me darling," his voice turned icy. "I understood everything." Fiona walked over to him. "They've been using you, Sebastian, all these 3 years. Your signature, your name, everything for their machinations. And you all this time. I tried to save you, no matter what." The police began to load the detainees into cars. Robert was silent, only throwing angry glances. Belinda continued to scream and threaten. "Mr. Wilson," the investigator approached. "We will need your testimony, but it looks like you were a victim of fraud. All the documents prove that you were unaware of their true intentions." Sebastian sat down on a rock, wrapping his arms around his head. "What a fool I am. I trusted her. I lost everything." "Not everything," Fiona said quietly. "You are alive. That's the main thing." He looked at her. "Why would you do that? After all that because we were family once, and I couldn't let them destroy you." Richard approached them, accompanied by police officers. "All documents have been handed over to the investigation. I confess to my involvement." "Good." Fiona nodded. "That will help the investigation." When the police cars drove away, only Fiona and Sebastian remained on the lake shore. They were silent for a long time, looking at the water. "You know," he finally said, "I used to come here a lot. I remembered how we dreamed of a house. And children," Fiona added quietly. "I was so selfish. I traded 25 years of our life for a beautiful illusion," she finished. "But now it's over. What will happen next? The police will deal with the fraud. You will most likely be a witness. And then you'll start a new life. And you?" Fiona stood up. "I'm going back to my shop. I've had enough of gardening." "Fiona." "Yes?" "Thank you. For everything." She nodded and walked to the car. The wind tousled her hair and a thought was running through her mind. It's over. It's finally over. In the police car, Belinda screamed, "I'll destroy her. Do you hear me, you old hag? I'll destroy you." But Fiona could no longer hear her. She was driving home, feeling strangely relieved. The mystery was solved, justice was restored. And what will happen next? Time will tell. 6 months passed like a day. Fiona was sitting in her small online store office watching the news. A high-profile fraud case is over. Robert Kingsley and Belinda Gray have been sentenced to 12 years in prison. Richard Harris, the manager who cooperated with the investigation, received a suspended sentence. A phone call interrupted her thoughts. "Fiona?" Sebastian's voice sounded uncertain. "Can we meet?" She froze for a moment. Over the months, they had only seen each other in court where they both testified. "Okay," she finally replied. "Do you know the Old Mill Cafe? The one where we used to—" "Yes, same place. I'll be there in an hour." The old mill hasn't changed much over the years. The same wooden tables, the same smell of fresh baked goods. Fiona chose a seat by the window where she and Sebastian had celebrated their first wedding anniversary. He came in a minute later. He had lost weight and grayed even more. There was a new depth in his eyes, maybe from the shock he had experienced. "Hello," he said, sitting down across from her. "Hi," she replied. "How are you?" "Fine. Trying to get back to normal. I sold the estate and went back to work in the workshop. That's good." They ordered coffee. The silence dragged on. "You know," Sebastian finally said, "I've been thinking all this time. Why did you do it? Why did you come to work in that mansion?" Fiona looked out the window. "At first, I just wanted to find evidence of your deception, to understand where our joint savings had gone. And then I saw what was really happening, and I couldn't just walk away." Sebastian looked down. "I was so stupid." "Yes, you were," she agreed calmly. "But you are not the first man to lose his head over a young beauty. It's not just that." He took a sip of coffee. "You know, after we lost our child," Fiona tensed. "They never talked about it. After that," he continued, "you changed. You threw yourself into your work, hardly ever came home. And you sought solace in a car repair shop," she smiled bitterly. "I'm not making excuses. It's just, when Belinda came along, she was so cheerful, so young, different. She didn't carry our pain." Fiona felt something tighten in her chest. "Do you think it was easy for me, carrying a baby for 9 months and losing it in childbirth?" "No, of course not. Do you know what the worst part is?" She looked him in the eye. "When I worked at the estate, I passed that rose bush every day, the one you planted in her honor." Sebastian shuddered. "You knew about it?" "Of course I did. I was your wife for 25 years. I knew everything about you." He was silent for a long time, then said quietly, "You know, when I saw you in the garden, something seemed familiar. Your movements, your look. But I couldn't believe it. And every day I was afraid that you would recognize me. Why? Because then everything would be lost. I wouldn't have been able to finish the job." They fell silent again. It was starting to rain outside. "Do you remember," Sebastian suddenly said, "how we once got caught in a downpour like this on our first vacation?" "At the lake," Fiona nodded. "We hid in an old boat. And you said it was the happiest day of your life, because it was. He looked at her. What happened to us, Fiona? Life happened. She shrugged her shoulders. We failed the test. What if— Don't say, if only, she interrupted him. It doesn't matter anymore. It does. He suddenly took her hand. You saved my life. After everything I've done. Fiona gently released her hand. I didn't do it for you. I did it for the woman I used to be. The woman who believed in love and justice. And now? Now I just want peace. She stood up. I have to go. Take care, Sebastian. Fiona. Yes? Have you forgiven me? She looked at him for a long time. You know, when I worked at the estate, I used to look at an old photo of us every night, and I thought, how could I have exchanged 25 years of life together for a beautiful wrapper? But then I realized that we were both to blame. You, because you were looking for easy ways. Because I closed myself off from the world after losing my child. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give. She went out into the rain without opening her umbrella. Drops mixed with tears on her face. Behind her was the man she once loved, the man she had saved, and a part of her life that she could finally let go of. In the cafe, Sebastian sat for a long time, staring at his empty cup. Images of the past floated before his eyes, their first date, their wedding, their shared dreams, and the image of the woman in work clothes who had come to save him, risking everything. What happened to us? He thought again, but there was no answer. There was only an empty cup and rain outside the window. Autumn was once again painting the city in golden colors. A year had passed since the dramatic events at the estate. Fiona stood at the window of her shop watching the leaves fall. Her online business was doing well. It turned out that the story about the fraudsters had attracted attention and added to the popularity of her clothing store for the elderly. Fiona! She heard a familiar voice. She turned around and saw Margaret standing on the doorstep with bags of groceries. You won't believe who I just met. Who? Richard. He's a security consultant at the bank now. Fiona smiled as she remembered the former estate manager. Who would have thought? He asked about you, by the way. Margaret raised her eyebrows meaningfully. Don't get me started, Fiona laughed. Last week he accidentally met me at the supermarket. And what did he do? He asked me to dinner. Can you imagine? He said he's always admired strong women. And you? I told him not to talk nonsense. I'm 63 years old. What a romantic evening. Was he offended? On the contrary, he laughed. He said that this was the kind of answer that attracted him. Margaret put the bags on the counter. You know, maybe he's right. You have changed this year. Fiona looked thoughtfully out the window. When I first started working at the estate, I was driven only by a thirst for revenge. I wanted to prove that I had been deceived. I wanted to punish those responsible. And then everything changed. When I realized that they were planning to kill me, she stopped. At that moment, revenge ceased to be the main thing. I just couldn't let anything terrible happen. Even after he left you, even after that. You know, it's a strange feeling to realize that you can save a person who once broke your heart. Margaret hugged her friend. You were always better than all of us. No, it's just that I finally realized who I really am. At that moment, the bell above the door announced a new customer. A young woman entered the store. Hello, are you Mrs. Thompson, the one who exposed the fraudsters? Fiona smiled. It's been a year and people still remember. Of course they do. You have become an example for many. My grandmother says you prove that you can fight for justice at any age. When the visitor left, Margaret shook her head. You see, you've become a local legend. Nonsense, Fiona waved it off. I just did what I had to do. In the evening, when she was closing the store, she took out a folder with documents, proof of Belinda and Robert's fraud. She hadn't kept them for the police or the court, just as a reminder that justice does exist. The phone rang unexpectedly. It was Sebastian. "Hi. I was wondering, can we talk? We've already said everything to each other." "Sebastian, I know. I just wanted to thank you. Again." "It's okay," she said softly. "Go on with your life. I am living mine. Are you happy?" Fiona looked at the photo on the wall of her in the garden of the mansion dressed as Mrs. Thompson. "You know, I finally realized that happiness is not something you get from others. It's something you make yourself." After the conversation, she sat in her chair for a long time, recalling the events of the past year. How she, a 62-year-old woman, decided to become a gardener at her ex-husband's estate. How she collected the evidence, how her hands trembled as she eavesdropped on Belinda's conversations, how her heart sank in fear of exposure. And then she remembered the moment at the lake when the police detained the criminals, Sebastian's face when he realized who she was, his surprise, gratitude, and shame. The doorbell interrupted her thoughts. Richard stood on the doorstep with a bouquet of flowers. "I was just passing by." "With a bouquet of roses?" She smiled. "Well, it just so happened," he said, embarrassed. "Maybe we should have dinner together?" Fiona looked at him, a little confused but sincere. "You know what? Let's just have tea, with those cakes you like." "Sure," he beamed. "By the way, did you hear? Belinda organized some kind of financial club in prison, and she got caught again?" "That's right. Some people never change. But others do," Fiona said quietly, letting him into the apartment. Later, when Richard left, she sat down to write in her diary, a habit that remained from her time at the estate. "Today I finally realized that revenge was never the real goal. The real goal was to find myself, to realize that I can be strong not because I want to prove something to someone, but because it is my essence. And sometimes the biggest victory is not a victory over others, but a victory over your past." She went to the window. The autumn sun was painting the city in warm colors. Somewhere in the jail, Belinda and Robert were sitting. Somewhere else, Sebastian was trying to start a new life. And she was finally free. Free from the pain, from the thirst for revenge, from the burden of the past. "It's time to cook," she said to herself and went to the kitchen. And in the table drawer was a folder with evidence, not as a weapon or tool of revenge, but as a reminder that justice exists, and that sometimes the best way to get revenge is to remain human. Putting the kettle on, Fiona looked around her cozy kitchen, filled with the smell of fresh cakes in an autumn evening. She was no longer the same person she was a year ago. She had grown beyond her past and learned to see it as a lesson, not a burden. Now she could smile again from the bottom of her heart, knowing that she still had many warm evenings ahead of her, conversations with friends, and maybe even a little story she hadn't finished yet.